Hello everyone, I hope you're having an absolutely wonderful day wherever you are in the world. Today we're going to talk about something that has a history far longer, far stranger, and far more fascinating than most people realise. The complete story of when humans first started smoking cannabis. Because the answer is not what you think, and the journey to get there involves ancient shamans, Scythian warriors, Chinese emperors, and eventually the entire modern world. But before we dive in, if you enjoy what I do here, please subscribe. It truly means everything to me. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I am always genuinely thrilled to see viewers from every single corner of the globe. Now, let's go find the first person who ever got high. You are standing in a field. It is somewhere in Central Asia, somewhere in the vast sun-bleached steppe that stretches between what we now call Western China and Eastern Europe. And the year is approximately 10,000 BCE. You're a human being, fully modern, neurologically identical to a person reading this script today. And you're looking at a plant. The plant is tall, taller than you might expect from something growing in this dry, marginal landscape. Its leaves are distinctive, the serrated, finger-like leaflets that once you've seen them, you will always recognise. It has a specific smell, earthy, slightly sharp, something that your nose registers as information-rich in a way that most plants are not. You are hungry, because people in 10,000 BCE are usually hungry. You're curious, because humans are always curious. And you're about to make a decision that will echo for 10,000 years. You reach out and pick some seeds. This is how most of the most consequential stories in human history begin. Not with dramatic ceremony, not with divine revelation, not with a moment of scientific insight. With hunger and curiosity, and a decision made in a moment by someone whose name history will never record. The plant is cannabis sativa, and the story of when humans started smoking it, truly smoking it, deliberately for its psychoactive effects, is one of the most fascinating, most debated, and most surprisingly ancient stories in the complete history of human intoxication. This is not a simple story. It does not have a single answer. It involves multiple independent discoveries across thousands of years and thousands of miles. It involves the evolution of a plant, the evolution of human culture, and the very specific question of how, exactly, you get from "this plant has useful fibre" to "this plant is why that man is laughing at nothing in the corner." But we are going to answer it, and the answer is much, much older than you expect. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The plant itself. Understanding cannabis before the story. Before we can answer when humans started smoking cannabis, we need to understand what cannabis actually is, because the plant's own biology is central to why the story went the way it did. Cannabis sativa, the species name, covers most cultivated cannabis, though botanists debate whether there are multiple species or simply subspecies, is what biologists call a camp follower. This means it is a plant that thrives in disturbed ground, in the nitrogen-rich soil around human habitation, in the specific ecological niches that human activity creates. Wherever ancient humans set up camp, cleared land, deposited organic waste, or created the specific environmental disruptions that agriculture produces, cannabis had a tendency to show up and flourish. This is not coincidence. It is evolution. Cannabis had, over millennia, developed a specific profile that made it extraordinarily useful to the human communities it grew near. Its seeds were nutritious, high in protein and fat, genuinely valuable as a food source. Its fibres were extraordinarily strong, among the most durable natural fibres available, producing rope, cloth, and eventually paper of remarkable quality. And somewhere in its biochemistry, developed as a defense against insects and ultraviolet radiation, it had accumulated a specific class of compounds, cannabinoids, most famously THC, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, that, when consumed by mammals, interacted with a receptor system that evolution had placed in the brains and bodies of virtually every vertebrate animal on the planet. The endocannabinoid system, the network of CB1 and CB2 receptors that THC mimics by binding to, did not evolve in response to cannabis. It evolved independently over hundreds of millions of years as a signaling system involved in memory, mood, pain, appetite, and numerous other functions. The cannabis plant, in developing compounds that happened to interact with this ancient system, accidentally found one of the most direct routes to influencing mammalian behavior that the plant kingdom has ever produced. This specificity matters for our story. Cannabis did not produce psychoactive effects accidentally. It produces them as a consequence of specific biochemistry that took millions of years to develop, and the humans who first encountered its psychoactive properties were not discovering something that required sophisticated preparation or specific knowledge. They were discovering something the plant had been doing for a very long time. The geographic origin of cannabis is the subject of ongoing scientific debate. The most current genetic and archaeological evidence places its origin somewhere in the region of the eastern Tibetan Plateau and surrounding areas of Central Asia, an area that encompasses parts of modern China, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and surrounding countries. From this origin point, cannabis spread, partly naturally, partly carried by human migration, in multiple directions, reaching Europe, India, the Middle East, and eventually the rest of the world over the course of thousands of years. The specific timeline of this spread is being actively refined by genetic analysis of ancient cannabis samples, by archaeological finds of cannabis seeds and pollen at prehistoric sites, and by the analysis of residues in ancient vessels that can identify specific cannabinoids even after thousands of years of preservation. The picture that is emerging is of a plant with an extraordinarily long history of human use, and with a specific history of psychoactive use that is older than most people have assumed. Chapter 2. The First Evidence. Archaeological Clues from Deep Time. Here is where the story gets genuinely exciting, because the archaeological evidence for early cannabis use is not where most people expect to find it, and the specific nature of that evidence has been transformed by recent discoveries that push the timeline back much further than previous scholarship assumed. For a long time, the conventional wisdom about early cannabis use was straightforward. The plant was used first for fibre. The oldest hemp fibre artifacts date to approximately 10,000 BCE in Taiwan and Japan. Then for food, hemp seeds as a nutritional source, and only later, much later, perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, for its psychoactive properties. This progression seemed logical. It suggested a gradual discovery of different uses, with the psychoactive properties being the last and most specialised application. The problem with this conventional wisdom is that it was based primarily on absence of evidence, rather than evidence of absence. Archaeologists had found hemp fibre artifacts very early. They had found hemp seed artifacts very early. They had not found early evidence of psychoactive use. But this might simply mean they had not been looking in the right places with the right techniques. Recent decades have changed this picture substantially. In 2019, a team of researchers published a study in the journal Science Advances that reported the analysis of wooden braziers, small incense burners, from the Zhejiang Cemetery in the Pamir Mountains of western China. These braziers dated to approximately 500 BCE. The residue inside them was analysed using gas chromatography and mass spectrometry, techniques that can identify specific organic compounds with extraordinary precision. The results were unambiguous. The residues contained high concentrations of THC, CBD, and CBN, the specific chemical fingerprint of cannabis that had been burned in these braziers. This was not a casual discovery. The Zhejiang Cemetery was a burial site. The people buried there were not poor agricultural workers casually using whatever grew nearby. They were, based on the archaeological context, individuals of some status, buried with specific grave goods in a specific ritual context, and the cannabis being burned was not low-potency hemp. The specific cannabinoid profile found in the braziers suggested plants with elevated THC content, plants that had either been selectively cultivated for psychoactive properties or had been sourced from specific high-altitude environments where cannabis naturally produces more THC. This discovery pushed the confirmed evidence of intentional psychoactive cannabis use back at least to 500 BCE in Central Asia. But it also raised a larger question. If people were burning high THC cannabis in ritual context in 500 BCE, when did they start? How long had this practice been going on before the specific braziers at Zhejiang were filled and sealed? The answer requires looking at other types of evidence. The pollen record is one source. Archaeological sites across Central Asia and into Europe show cannabis pollen in sediment layers dating back thousands of years before the written record. The presence of cannabis pollen near human habitation sites tells us that cannabis was being grown, or that it was growing near human communities. does not tell us definitively why, but the pattern of cannabis pollen appearing and increasing in association with human settlement, rather than as a simple background environmental feature, suggests deliberate cultivation. Genetic analysis of cannabis populations provides another line of evidence. The specific genetic divergence between fiber-type hemp and drug-type cannabis, the populations bred for psychoactive properties versus those bred for fiber, began, according to the best current genetic estimates, approximately 12,000 years ago. If deliberate breeding for drug-type characteristics was occurring 12,000 years ago, deliberate use of the psychoactive properties that were being selected for must have preceded or accompanied that breeding. Put these lines of evidence together, and the picture that emerges is of a plant whose psychoactive properties were likely known and used far earlier than the conventional 3,000 to 4,000 year timeline suggested. How much earlier is the current frontier of the research? Chapter 3. The Ancient Chinese Record, Emperors and Herbal Medicine. The oldest written references to cannabis as a psychoactive or medicinal substance come from China, and they are old enough to suggest that by the time they were written, cannabis use had already been established for a very long time. You're in China, approximately 2700 BCE. The specific emperor associated with this story is Shen Nong, the divine farmer or divine husbandman, a semi-mythological figure credited in Chinese tradition with the invention of agriculture, the development of herbal medicine, and the specific classification of hundreds of plants according to their medicinal properties. The text attributed to Shen Nong, the Shenong Benkao Jing, or the Divine Farmer's Classic of Herbal Medicine, is one of the foundational documents of Chinese traditional medicine. It lists approximately 365 medicinal substances, organized by their properties and their uses. Cannabis, called Emma in Chinese, appears in the Shenong Benkao Jing as both a medicinal substance and as a plant with specific effects on the mind. The text describes cannabis preparations for a range of conditions including gout, malaria, and rheumatism. It also notes, and this is the relevant passage for our story, that consuming large quantities of MA will make the user see demons and cause them to walk about wildly. This is a psychoactive effect. The specific description of hallucinations and altered behavior following cannabis consumption is not the description of a plant used purely for fiber or food. Someone, or multiple someones, had consumed cannabis in quantities sufficient to produce these effects, had observed the specific pattern of effects that resulted, and had recorded those observations with sufficient accuracy to be recognized as describing cannabis intoxication more than 4,000 years later. The caveat here is important. The text attributed to Shen Nong was not written by Shen Nong. The historical Shen Nong, if he existed at all in the form the tradition describes, lived roughly 4,700 years ago. The text bearing his name was compiled and written down centuries or millennia after the period it purports to describe, drawing on oral traditions and earlier written records that have not survived. The specific dating of the knowledge in the text is therefore uncertain. It may describe practices that were genuinely ancient when the text was compiled, or it may reflect practices current at the time of writing, attributed to an ancient authority to give them legitimacy. But even accounting for this uncertainty, the Shenong Benkao Jing provides important evidence. It shows that by some point in Chinese history that is genuinely ancient, cannabis and its psychoactive properties were well enough known to be included in a systematic medical reference. This was not a novel discovery at the time of writing. It was established knowledge, treated matter-of-factly alongside hundreds of other medicinal substances. The specific history of cannabis in Chinese medicine extends well beyond Shen Nong. Other classical Chinese medical texts discuss cannabis in various forms: the seeds, ma ren, as nutritive food and gentle laxative, the female flower clusters, ma fen, as a substance with more potent medicinal and psychoactive properties, preparations of various plant parts for specific conditions. The trajectory of Chinese medical cannabis literature reflects a sophisticated, empirically grounded engagement with the plant that spans thousands of years. The Chinese engagement with cannabis was not primarily recreational, as far as the written record reveals. The psychoactive properties were acknowledged, sometimes explicitly warned against in contexts where the goal was therapeutic rather than intoxicating use, and incorporated into specific ceremonial and religious practices in ways that we will examine more fully when we discuss Taoist ritual practices. but the dominant mode of Chinese cannabis engagement in the historical record is medical, the systematic application of a plant's properties to therapeutic ends within the framework of traditional Chinese medicine. This doesn't mean recreational or spiritual use wasn't happening. It means that the Chinese literary tradition, which was heavily shaped by Confucian values of order and propriety, tended to record the medicinal uses more thoroughly than the intoxicating ones. Chapter 4. The Scythians, the people who invented the hotbox. Now we move to one of the most dramatic and most well-documented early accounts of deliberate psychoactive cannabis use, and it involves a people who were, by any standard, one of the more remarkable civilizations of the ancient world. The Scythians were a nomadic people of Iranian origin who dominated the Eurasian steppe, the vast grassland belt stretching from the Black Sea to the borders of China, from roughly the 9th century BCE to the 4th century CE. They were extraordinary horseback riders, fierce warriors, sophisticated metallurgists, and creators of some of the most spectacular gold art of the ancient world. They were also, as the Greek historian Herodotus described in the 5th century BCE, enthusiastic cannabis users. Herodotus, the father of history, writing around 440 BCE, provided one of the most vivid and specific accounts of ancient cannabis use that survives from the ancient world. In his histories, he described a specific Scythian funeral practice with unusual detail. The Scythians, he wrote, took the seeds of cannabis and crawled under small wool tents, where they threw the seeds onto red-hot stones. The resulting vapour, Herodotus reported, made the Scythians howl with pleasure. This is a hotbox, an ancient Bronze Age hotbox conducted under a felt tent by nomadic warriors on the Eurasian steppe approximately 2,500 years ago. For many years, historians debated whether Herodotus was being accurate or embellishing. The account was vivid, but came from an outsider observing a foreign culture through possibly imperfect translation and interpretation. Could the seeds he described have been hemp seeds, which have minimal psychoactive properties? Was the vapour really cannabis smoke or something else? The 2019 discovery at Dzerzhankal settled this debate decisively. The Dzerzhankal cemetery, which dates to approximately the same period as Herodotus's account, and is located precisely in the region associated with the eastern steppe cultures related to the Scythians, contained braziers with unambiguous cannabis residue showing elevated THC content. Herodotus was right. The Scythians were smoking cannabis deliberately in ritual contexts, with plants that had been selected or sourced for their psychoactive potency. But here's the part that makes the Scythian cannabis story even more interesting. It wasn't just a funeral practice. The broader archaeological record of Scythian culture, the specific grave goods, the ritual objects, the portable items that nomadic people carry with them, shows cannabis associated with shamanic and ritual contexts across a much wider range of circumstances. The Scythian shaman, the specific religious specialist who mediated between the human and spirit worlds, was the figure most associated with cannabis use in Scythian culture. The specific altered state produced by cannabis inhalation in the specific enclosed tent environment described by Herodotus was, in the Scythian religious context, not recreational intoxication. It was a technology of the sacred, a method for achieving the specific altered consciousness that the shaman needed to communicate with spirits, divine the future, and perform the specific religious functions that held the nomadic community together. This shamanic framework for psychoactive plant use was not unique to the Scythians. It is in fact one of the most consistent patterns in the cross-cultural anthropology of psychoactive substances. Across cultures and across millennia, psychoactive plants appear first in the archaeological and historical record not as recreational substances but as shamanic tools, methods for achieving altered consciousness in specific ritual contexts, under the supervision of specialists who understood the specific effects and could guide the experience towards specific ends. The Scythian cannabis tradition is significant not only as documentation of ancient psychoactive use, but as evidence of the specific geographic bridge through which cannabis knowledge travelled westward. The Scythians ranged across the entirety of the Eurasian steppe, from Central Asia to the Black Sea and the edges of the Greek world. Their cannabis practices, combined with their trade relationships and military interactions with Greek, Persian and other cultures, made them a specific vector for the transmission of cannabis knowledge from its Central Asian origin point toward the rest of the world. Chapter 5. ancient India, Shiva's plant and the Vedic tradition. Move south from the Scythian steppe, and you arrive in the other major ancient civilization with a documented deep and theologically rich tradition of cannabis use, India. The Indian cannabis tradition is, by any measure, one of the oldest and most elaborately developed in human history. It is also, uniquely among ancient cannabis traditions, still alive and practiced today in essentially the same forms that ancient texts describe, making India one of the few places where we can observe, in living practice, something close to what ancient cannabis use looked like. The earliest Indian references to cannabis appear in the Vedas, the oldest scriptures of the Hindu religious tradition, some of which date to approximately 1500 to 2000 BCE, though scholars debate the specific dating. The Atharva Veda, one of the four Vedas, includes references to bhang, a preparation of cannabis, among 5 sacred plants, and describes it as a source of happiness, liberation, and as a vehicle for the deity Shiva. The connection between cannabis and Shiva, one of the most important deities in the Hindu tradition, the destroyer-creator, the god of yoga and meditation, and the transcendence of ordinary consciousness, is one of the most theologically significant and most enduring associations in the history of any psychoactive substance. According to Hindu legend, Shiva discovered cannabis on the slopes of Mount Kailash, consumed it, and was refreshed and delighted. This is why, in the tradition, Shiva is sometimes called Lord of Bhang, and why cannabis offerings at Shiva temples remain a feature of Hindu religious practice to the present day. The specific preparations of cannabis in the Indian tradition represent a pharmaceutical sophistication that reflects thousands of years of empirical refinement. Bhang is the mildest preparation, a drink made from ground cannabis leaves and flowers, typically mixed with milk, spices, and sometimes other ingredients. Bhang has been consumed in India for at least 3,000 years, is legal throughout most of India to the present day, and is particularly associated with the festival of Holi, where it is consumed communally in a context of celebration and religious observance. Bhang produced from the less potent leaf material was, and is, a relatively mild experience, allowing substantial quantities to be consumed without the more intense effects of stronger preparations. Ganja refers specifically to the female flower clusters of the cannabis plant, the material that contains the highest concentrations of THC. The use of ganja for its more potent psychoactive effects was associated in the Indian tradition primarily with sadhus, the wandering Hindu ascetics who renounced worldly life in pursuit of spiritual liberation. For the sadhu, cannabis was not a recreational substance, but a specific spiritual tool, a method for achieving the particular state of consciousness associated with meditation, with the dissolution of the ego, and with the direct experience of divine reality that was the goal of the ascetic life. Charas is the most concentrated traditional preparation, cannabis resin collected by hand-rolling the flower clusters, a process that produces a substance roughly equivalent to hashish. Charas production requires skill and patience, and the specific regions of India and Nepal, where high-quality charas was and is produced, the Parvati Valley in Himachal Pradesh, various Himalayan locations, have become legendary in the global cannabis culture. The specific Indian tradition of viewing cannabis as a sacred substance rather than merely a recreational one has profound implications for understanding the full history of cannabis use. When the Indian tradition describes cannabis as facilitating spiritual experience, it is making a claim that modern neuroscience can engage with in interesting ways. The cannabis plant's interaction with the endocannabinoid system does produce specific effects on the brain's default mode network, the specific neural circuitry associated with self-referential thought, with the sense of individual identity, and with the specific cognitive patterns that meditation and contemplative practice attempt to modify. Whether cannabis produces genuine spiritual experience in the metaphysical sense is a question that neuroscience cannot answer. That it produces experiences that the people having them interpret as spiritually meaningful is well documented. The Vedic and post-Vedic Indian tradition developed, over thousands of years, an extraordinarily detailed practical knowledge of cannabis, which preparations were appropriate for which purposes, which set and setting conditions produced, which effects, which populations should use it and which should not, and what the specific spiritual and medical applications of different preparations were. This practical knowledge, accumulated through millennia of direct experience, represents one of the most sophisticated bodies of cannabis knowledge ever developed, and it did so independently of the Central Asian and Western traditions. Chapter 6: Ancient Egypt and the Middle East, Smoke and Medicine. The cannabis story in the ancient Middle East and North Africa is more fragmentary than the Central Asian or Indian records, but the fragments that exist are genuinely interesting and suggest a much wider distribution of cannabis knowledge in the ancient world than historical scholarship had assumed until recently. Ancient Egyptian evidence for cannabis use comes from several sources. Chemical analysis of mummies has detected cannabinoids in preserved tissue, suggesting that cannabis was consumed, in some form by some individuals, in ancient Egypt. The specific Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical documents in the world, dating to approximately 1550 BCE, though describing practices that may be much older, includes references to a substance identified by some Egyptologists as cannabis, prescribed for various conditions including inflammation. The specific identification of ancient Egyptian references to cannabis is complicated by the translation challenges of ancient Egyptian botanical vocabulary. The same species might be described by different names in different texts, and matching ancient names to modern species is not always straightforward. But the chemical evidence from mummies, combined with the growing archaeological record of cannabis in the ancient Near East more broadly, suggests that cannabis was known and used in ancient Egypt. The Mesopotamian record is similarly fragmentary but present. Texts from ancient Mesopotamia, the civilization of ancient Iraq, home to some of the earliest writing in human history, include references to a substance described as kunabu that many scholars identify as cannabis, used in medical and religious contexts. The specific Akkadian medical texts that include kunabu describe it as being burned, specifically burned in censers for its smoke, in contexts that suggest both medical and ritual use. The burning of cannabis in censers, the specific practice of creating cannabis smoke in an enclosed space for ritual or medical purposes, appears to be a different tradition from the Scythian felt tent hotbox, but produces similar pharmacological results. The specific use of incense and aromatic substances in religious ritual across the ancient Near East is well documented, and the inclusion of cannabis among the substances burned in these contexts, whether as a specific identified plant or as part of broader incense mixtures, would have produced psychoactive effects in participants that the ritual's designers may or may not have understood in pharmacological terms. The ancient Hebrew tradition's engagement with cannabis has been a matter of scholarly debate for decades. In 2020, archaeologists reported the discovery of cannabis residue on an altar at the Tel Arad shrine in Israel, dated to approximately 700 BCE. Direct chemical evidence of cannabis burning in an ancient Israelite ritual context. The specific identification of cannabosum, a substance mentioned in the Hebrew Bible as one of the ingredients of the holy anointing oil, as cannabis has been argued by some scholars based on both linguistic and pharmacological evidence. This identification remains contested but has not been definitively refuted. The ancient Persian tradition, associated with the Zoroastrian religion, also includes references to haoma, a sacred ritual drink with specific psychoactive properties that has been identified by some scholars as cannabis-based, though others argue for other psychoactive plants. The specific Zoroastrian sacred fire, which was central to that religion's ritual practice, was sometimes described in contexts suggesting that aromatic and psychoactive plants were burned in it, which would have produced specific effects on the participants in the ritual. What the Middle Eastern and North African evidence adds to the picture is evidence of wide geographic distribution of cannabis knowledge in the ancient world. By the middle of the first millennium BCE, cannabis appears, in different forms, in different cultural contexts with different specific uses, across a vast geographic area stretching from Central Asia to North Africa. The specific pathways by which this knowledge spread are the subject of active research, but the pattern of distribution itself is clear enough to support the conclusion that cannabis and its properties were known across this entire region by at least 2,500 to 3,000 years ago. Chapter 7: The Greek and Roman World. Knowing about it. The ancient Greeks and Romans occupy an interesting position in the history of cannabis use. They clearly knew about it, wrote about it, and could describe its effects with accuracy. But their own culture's engagement with it was substantially less enthusiastic than the cultures to their east and south. Herodotus, whom we have already met in the Scythian chapter, was not merely reporting the cannabis practices of foreigners as exotic curiosities, He was documenting them as a historian who understood their significance, and his account suggests that cannabis was sufficiently known in the Greek world to be worth detailed description rather than simply categorized as another foreign oddity. The Greek physician Dioscorides, whose De Materia Medica, written in the 1st century CE, was the most important pharmacological reference in the Western world for 15 centuries, included cannabis in his systematic catalogue of medicinal plants. He described both the fibre and seed uses and the psychoactive properties of the plant, noting that excessive consumption of the seeds quenches desire and taken too often diminishes the substance of the genitals. This is not the description of someone who has never encountered the plant. It reflects specific empirical knowledge of its effects. Galen, the most influential physician of the classical world, writing in the 2nd century CE, described cannabis being used in social contexts by wealthy Romans at dinner parties, past, around after meals as a digestive aid and social lubricant. This is, in the classical Roman world, the earliest documented recreational cannabis use in the Western tradition, and Galen noted it with the specific tone of someone reporting an established social practice rather than a novel discovery. But the Greek and Roman engagement with cannabis never developed into the elaborate cultural and religious traditions that characterized the Scythian, Indian, or Central Asian traditions. The Greeks and Romans had wine, the specific psychoactive substance around which their social, religious, and cultural life was organized, and the specific cultural framework that made wine the vehicle for everything from symposium philosophy to religious ritual left relatively little space for a new psychoactive plant from the exotic East. There is also a specific pharmacological consideration. The cannabis available in the Mediterranean world was, on average, of lower THC content than the cannabis of the high-altitude Central Asian environments, where the plant had been most selectively cultivated. The specific environmental pressures that cause cannabis to produce more THC, high altitude, high ultraviolet radiation, specific temperature conditions, were less present in the Mediterranean. This means that the cannabis experience available to the average Greek or Roman was likely a milder one than what the Scythians or Indian sadhus were experiencing. The Greek physician Pedanius Dioscorides, mentioned above, also recorded cannabis's medical uses in some detail, for pain, for earache, for inflammation. These medical uses were genuine and reflected real pharmacological properties of the plant. The specific trajectory of Western engagement with cannabis, primarily medical, with social use present but secondary, was established in the Greek and Roman period and would persist into and through the medieval world. Chapter 8. The Islamic Golden Age. Hashish enters the story. The specific form of cannabis that would dominate the Western imagination for most of the medieval and early modern period, hashish, developed its cultural prominence primarily through the Islamic world, and the story of hashish in Islamic civilization is one of the most richly documented chapters in the complete history of cannabis use. Hashish, the Arabic word from which all the European variants derive, refers specifically to concentrated cannabis resin, produced by separating the trichomes from the plant material. The production of hashish, rather than simply consuming the whole plant material, represented a specific technological development that increased potency and created a more concentrated, more transportable product. The Islamic world of the 8th through 13th centuries, the Islamic Golden Age, was, among its many other achievements, the period when hashish culture developed into a recognized and elaborately documented social phenomenon. The specific Arabic and Persian medical and literary literature of this period contains hundreds of references to hashish, its effects, its medical uses, its social contexts, and the specific debates about whether its consumption was permitted or forbidden under Islamic law. The Islamic legal debate about hashish is itself fascinating. Unlike alcohol, which the Quran explicitly forbids, cannabis is not mentioned in Islamic scripture. This created a specific jurisprudential problem. The drug's effects were clearly similar in some respects to those of alcohol, intoxication, altered judgment, yet it lacked the explicit Quranic prohibition. Different legal schools and different periods of Islamic jurisprudence reached different conclusions, and the specific ongoing debate about cannabis's legal status in Islamic law was never fully resolved in the medieval period. Avicenna ibn Sina, the most important physician of the Islamic Golden Age, writing in the 10th and 11th centuries, described cannabis in considerable detail in his Canon of Medicine. He noted its medical uses, its intoxicating properties, and its potential for abuse, writing with the specific clinical authority of someone who had both studied the plant extensively and had access to centuries of accumulated Islamic medical knowledge about it. The canon became the primary medical text of European universities after its translation into Latin, carrying Islamic cannabis knowledge directly into the Western medical tradition. The story of the assassins, the Nizari Ismaili sect whose name, in the legend promoted by the Crusader chroniclers, was derived from their supposed use of hashish, is one of the most famous and most thoroughly debunked cannabis myths in history. The legend, propagated by Marco Polo among others, held that the sect's leader, the Old Man of the Mountain, motivated his followers by giving them hashish, transporting them to a garden paradise, and then withdrawing the drug, creating a motivation to return to paradise through loyal service and assassination. This story is almost certainly false in its specific details. The Nizari Ismailis were a serious religious and political organization with sophisticated theological and philosophical traditions, and their military activities were motivated by genuine religious conviction, rather than drug-induced paradise visions. The specific etymology connecting assassin to hashishin, hashish user, is contested, with other explanations for the word's origin being linguistically plausible. But the legend's popularity, it circulated through the Crusader and post-Crusader European world with remarkable persistence, tells us something important about the cultural position of hashish in medieval European consciousness. It was the Eastern drug par excellence, associated with Islamic civilization, with exotic customs, with the specific alterity of the non-Christian world. It was simultaneously feared, condescended to, and fascinated about, and gradually, through trade routes and cultural exchange, it was becoming known directly. Chapter 9. Medieval Europe, Rediscovery and Ambivalence. Medieval European engagement with cannabis as a psychoactive substance is a story of gradual rediscovery, of a substance whose psychoactive properties had been known in classical antiquity, had been documented by Greek and Roman physicians, and had then receded from European cultural consciousness before re-emerging through contact with the Islamic world and through the specific needs of medieval medicine. The hemp plant was ubiquitous in medieval Europe, as we have discussed, for its extraordinarily useful fibre. The specific plants being grown for fibre in medieval England, France and Germany were unlikely to have had high THC content, having been selected over generations primarily for fibre quality rather than psychoactive potency. The medieval European hemp farmer was not, in general, producing a product whose psychoactive effects would have been notable to anyone consuming them. But the medical tradition preserved knowledge of cannabis's other properties. Hildegard of Bingen, the remarkable 12th century German abbess, composer, scientist and medical writer, mentioned hemp in her medical writings, noting both its fibre uses and its effects when consumed, which she described as producing headache-like effects. It oppresses one's heart. This is a specific description of a physiological effect that suggests direct or reported experience of cannabis's properties, not merely a textual copying from ancient sources. The specific herbal traditions of medieval Europe, the collections of plant knowledge maintained by monasteries, by lay healers, and by the learned physicians who translated and extended classical medical knowledge, consistently included hemp and consistently recorded, with varying degrees of explicitness, its psychoactive properties alongside its medical ones. The specific medieval category of intoxicating herbs, the group of plants known to affect consciousness and used in specific medical and occasionally ritual contexts, was well established in medieval herbal knowledge. The witch trial context is one of the most compelling and most debated aspects of medieval European cannabis history. The specific flying ointments attributed to witches in the confessions extracted during the witch trial period, ointments that supposedly allowed witches to fly to their Sabbaths, have been analysed by historians and pharmacologists with considerable interest. These ointments were described in multiple independent confessions as containing specific plant ingredients that were applied to the skin or to broomsticks used as applicators for intimate skin areas. The specific plants named in these ointment recipes are, to a pharmacologist, immediately recognisable as a collection of powerful psychoactives: henbane, deadly nightshade, mandrake. In some versions, cannabis. These plants, absorbed through mucous membranes or broken skin, would produce specific effects that included visions of flight, hallucinations of travel to distant places, and the specific experiences of meeting and dancing with supernatural beings. all central features of the Sabbath experience as described by confessing witches. The most likely pharmacological explanation for the flying witch confessions is that some practitioners of folk religious and magical traditions were using these plant preparations, including potentially cannabis preparations, to achieve specific altered states of consciousness that they interpreted in the theological vocabulary available to them. The flight to the Sabbath was, in this interpretation, not actual physical travel, but a vivid, drug-induced visionary experience, real in its subjective intensity, interpreted through the specific cultural lens of popular magical belief. Whether cannabis was specifically a regular component of these preparations is uncertain. The evidence is sufficient to suggest that it was known and used in some contexts, but not sufficient to conclude that it was a primary ingredient in the way that the nightshade alkaloids appear to have been. Chapter 10. The Silk Road. The highway of getting high to understand how cannabis knowledge and cannabis itself travelled across the ancient and medieval world, you need to understand the Silk Road, the network of trade routes that connected China to the Mediterranean, and that carried not just silk but ideas, religions, technologies, diseases and psychoactive substances across the Eurasian landmass for approximately 2,000 years. The Silk Road was not a single road, it was a network of routes, overland through Central Asia, maritime through the Indian Ocean, that connected the major civilizations of Eurasia in a web of trade and cultural exchange that persisted from roughly the 2nd century BCE to the 15th century CE. Along these routes, goods flowed in multiple directions, and with the goods flowed knowledge of technologies, of religions, of medical practices, and of the specific substances that different cultures had found useful or pleasurable. Cannabis travelled on the Silk Road in multiple forms. As fibre, it was traded across enormous distances. The specific quality of Central Asian hemp fibre was recognised and valued in markets from China to Rome. As seeds, it moved between agricultural communities as a food and oil source, and as a psychoactive substance, in the form of prepared cannabis resin, dried flower material, or the specific knowledge of its properties. It travelled with the specific communities that used it most extensively, the nomadic peoples of Central Asia whose territories spanned the Silk Road routes. The specific role of Silk Road trade in the diffusion of cannabis knowledge is visible in the geographic distribution of cannabis use documented in the archaeological and historical record. The pattern of cannabis appearing in ritual and medical contexts along the Silk Road routes, in Central Asia, in Persia, in northern India, gradually westward into the Islamic world and eventually into Europe, maps directly onto the known trading and migration routes of the Silk Road period. The specific transmission of cannabis knowledge was not simply passive diffusion, it was actively carried by specific groups, the merchants who travelled the routes, the Buddhist monks who moved between India and China and carried their medical and spiritual knowledge with them. Buddhist texts describe cannabis as a medicine and as a substance used in meditation, and the military and nomadic peoples whose movements across the steppe brought Central Asian practices into contact with settled civilizations on both ends of the routes. The Buddhist transmission is particularly interesting. The specific Buddhist prohibition on intoxicants, which appears in the monastic codes as a rule against consuming fermented drinks, has been interpreted differently in different Buddhist traditions, and the specific relationship between cannabis and Buddhist practice has varied considerably across time and place. In some Tibetan Buddhist traditions, cannabis has been used in specific tantric ritual contexts. In some Zen contexts, it was used medically. The specific patterns of Buddhist cannabis use across Asia represent a rich and underexplored dimension of the plant's cultural history. The Islamic trade networks that succeeded and overlapped with the Silk Road in the medieval period carried cannabis knowledge further westward. The specific Arabic word for cannabis, hashish, entered European languages through this contact, and the specific Islamic pharmacological tradition, with its sophisticated understanding of cannabis's properties, entered European medicine through the translations of Arabic medical texts that were the primary vehicle for the recovery of classical learning in medieval Europe. Chapter 11. The Americas. Independent discovery. The cannabis story in the Americas is, in important respects, different from the Old World story, and the differences reveal something important about the nature of the human relationship with this plant. Cannabis is not native to the Americas. The specific plant that indigenous American peoples used in various psychoactive contexts, which Europeans who encountered it mistakenly or deliberately conflated with cannabis, was primarily tobacco, Nicotiana tabacum and related species. The specific smoking culture that European explorers encountered in the Americas, which so dramatically influenced subsequent global smoking practices, was a tobacco culture, not a cannabis culture. Cannabis arrived in the Americas with European colonizers. The Spanish and Portuguese introduced hemp cultivation to their American colonies in the 16th century, primarily for its fiber value in making rope and sailcloth for the colonial maritime economy. Hemp cultivation was legally mandated in some colonial contexts precisely because of the maritime industry's dependence on hemp rope. The specific question of when Americans, meaning residents of the Americas in the modern period, started using cannabis for its psychoactive properties rather than purely for fiber is a 19th and 20th century story, rather than an ancient one, shaped by the specific migration patterns of the 19th century and the specific development of cannabis culture in the Americas through a combination of Mexican, Caribbean, and eventually global cultural influences. The Mexican connection is crucial. Cannabis, known in Mexico as marijuana, developed a specific cultural presence in Mexico and the American Southwest in the 19th century, associated with rural and working-class Mexican communities, with specific patterns of use that were distinct from both the elite cannabis use documented in Islamic courts and the religious use documented in India and Central Asia. The specific route by which cannabis use became associated with Mexican-American communities and then spread to broader American culture through jazz musicians, migrant workers, and eventually the counterculture of the 20th century is a story that is both the final chapter of the ancient history we have been telling and the first chapter of the modern crisis and culture around cannabis. But that is a story for another video. For our purposes, the question of when humans first started smoking weed, the Americas are a late arrival to a story that was already ancient long before European ships reached the New World. Chapter 12. The 19th and 20th centuries. Cannabis comes west. The specific story of how cannabis arrived in Western Europe and North America as a cultural phenomenon, how it moved from a substance known in medical texts and exotic travel accounts to a substance actually used by ordinary people in Paris and London and New York, is one of the more colourful chapters in the plant's long history. The Napoleonic connection is one starting point. When Napoleon's army invaded Egypt in 1798, they encountered a cannabis-using culture. Egyptian commoners were smoking hashish extensively, and the French troops were both curious and enthusiastic. Napoleon issued military orders prohibiting his soldiers from using hashish, noting that the substance deprived man of his reason and causes violent deliriums. The specific order also indicates that the soldiers were ignoring it, because if nobody was using hashish, there would be nothing to prohibit. French soldiers who returned from Egypt brought with them not only an interest in Egyptology and the specific cultural legacy that produced the Rosetta Stone, but also a familiarity with hashish. By the 1840s, hashish use had developed a specific cultural presence in Paris, centered on the Club des Hachishins, Club of the Hashish Eaters, a group that included some of the most significant literary and artistic figures of the French Romantic movement, including Théophile Gautier, Charles Baudelaire, and Gérard de Nerval. These were not casual experimenters. They were serious writers and artists exploring altered consciousness with the specific intellectual rigour of people who would write extensively about what they found there. Baudelaire's Les Paradis Artificiels, Artificial Paradises, published in 1860, remains one of the most acute descriptions of the cannabis experience ever written. Baudelaire described the specific phenomenology of hashish intoxication with extraordinary literary precision, the enhancement of sensory experience, the specific distortion of time perception, the waves of euphoria, the specific philosophical insights that seem profound in the moment, and sometimes survived sober analysis and sometimes did not. His ambivalence about the substance, finding it fascinating and transformative, while ultimately judging it inferior to natural consciousness as a vehicle for artistic creation, is one of the first sophisticated Western engagements with the specific question of what psychoactive substances do and don't offer. The British encounter with cannabis in the 19th century came primarily through the Indian colonial experience. British physicians and administrators in India observed the extensive and varied uses of cannabis in Indian culture, and the specific investigation of Indian hemp that the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission undertook in 1893 to 1894 remains one of the most thorough and honest official investigations of cannabis ever conducted. The Commission's conclusion that moderate use of hemp drugs was relatively harmless, and that prohibition would be both impractical and unnecessary, stands in stark contrast to the policy conclusions that 20th century governments would reach. The American cannabis story of the 19th century was simultaneously a medical story and a cultural one. Cannabis tinctures and preparations were widely available in American pharmacies in the latter half of the 19th century, recommended for an enormous range of conditions. The specific experience of cannabis as medicine was therefore not unfamiliar to American patients and physicians. What was less developed was any cultural tradition of recreational use, and it was the specific development of that tradition in the early 20th century, through the specific vectors of Mexican immigration and African American jazz culture, that would eventually produce the cultural conflict around cannabis that defined the 20th century. Chapter 13. The Jazz Age and the Prohibition of Weed, the specific criminalization of cannabis in the United States, and subsequently, through American influence over international drug policy, throughout much of the world, is a story with specific racial and cultural dimensions that cannot be understood without understanding the specific demographics of cannabis use in early 20th century America. You are in New Orleans in 1920. The Jazz Age is beginning. The specific musical culture that has developed in New Orleans, combining African American musical traditions with European harmony and the specific rhythmic innovations that African American musicians had been developing since the end of slavery, is producing something new, something vital, something that the rest of the country and eventually the world will want to hear. And within this musical culture, cannabis, marijuana, the Spanish word brought up from Mexico, is a consistent presence. The specific association of cannabis with jazz musicians was not incidental. The specific effects of cannabis on musical perception, the way it alters the experience of time, the way it enhances auditory detail, the way it can facilitate the specific improvisational mindset that jazz requires, made it appealing to musicians in ways that were recognized within the culture. Louis Armstrong was a lifelong cannabis user who spoke about it openly and positively. Cab Calloway wrote songs about it. The specific vocabulary of jazz, reefer, tea, muggles, dos gauge, was a cannabis vocabulary. The specific racial politics of cannabis criminalization are well documented by historians. Harry Anslinger, the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics from 1930 to 1962, and the primary architect of American cannabis prohibition, was explicit in his racist associations of cannabis with black and Hispanic communities in his public statements. The specific Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, which effectively prohibited cannabis in the United States, was passed in a legislative atmosphere in which the drug was consistently associated, in congressional testimony and in the media campaign that supported the legislation, with racial minorities, criminality, and moral degeneracy. The specific scientific evidence that was presented to support prohibition was, by any modern assessment, fraudulent. The specific reefer madness narrative that cannabis caused violent crime and insanity was not supported by the evidence available at the time and has been thoroughly refuted since. The Indian Hemp Drugs Commission's careful 1894 conclusions were ignored. The American Medical Association's testimony opposing prohibition was dismissed. The specific political and cultural motivations for prohibition, the targeting of substances associated with minority communities, the specific interests of industries threatened by hemp's commercial potential, the moral entrepreneurship of specific individuals, were more powerful than the evidence. The international dimensions of cannabis prohibition were established through the same mechanisms, primarily American political pressure, that created the global architecture of drug prohibition. The specific international drug control treaties of the 20th century, particularly the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, which classified cannabis alongside heroin as a Schedule I substance with no accepted medical use, imposed American-influenced prohibition on countries with their own ancient cannabis traditions, including India, which had to negotiate a specific exemption for traditional bhang use. Chapter 14. The Counterculture and Beyond. Cannabis comes full circle. The story of cannabis in the second half of the 20th century is the story of a substance that had been driven underground by prohibition emerging through the specific cultural dynamics of the 1960s counterculture into the most widespread and most politically visible cannabis culture in human history. The specific mechanism by which cannabis moved from the margins of American culture to the centre was the counterculture of the 1960s, the specific generational and cultural rebellion that produced the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the sexual revolution, and alongside and intertwined with all of these, the specific widespread adoption of cannabis by young white middle-class Americans who had previously been insulated from it by the specific racial geography of drug culture. This demographic shift, from a primarily black and Hispanic cannabis culture to a biracial and eventually broadly multiracial one, had specific political consequences. When the children of middle-class white families were being arrested for cannabis possession, in the early 1970s, the specific political calculation around drug enforcement began to shift in ways it had not when the people being arrested were primarily people of colour. Richard Nixon's war on drugs, declared in 1971, was partly a response to this shift, an attempt to reassert control through enforcement at a moment when the cultural tide was running the other way. Nixon's aide John Ehrlichman would later state explicitly that the war on drugs was designed to target black people and anti-war protesters by associating their communities with heroin and marijuana respectively, a confession of the specific political motivations that lay beneath the public health rhetoric. The science of cannabis was being transformed in the same period. The isolation of THC by Raphael Mechoulam in 1964 provided the first complete understanding of the specific compound responsible for cannabis's psychoactive effects. The subsequent discovery of the endocannabinoid system, the receptor network that THC interacts with, revealed that human and animal brains had evolved specific receptors for cannabis-like compounds, raising profound questions about the coevolution of humans and cannabis and the specific role of this receptor system in normal brain function. The medical renaissance of cannabis, the specific re-emergence of cannabis as a recognised medical substance after decades of prohibition, began in earnest in the 1990s with California's passage of Proposition 215 in 1996, the first modern American medical cannabis law. The specific conditions for which cannabis was being rediscovered medically, pain, nausea from chemotherapy, appetite stimulation in AIDS wasting, specific forms of epilepsy, were conditions for which the ancient traditions had also recognised its value, and the modern clinical evidence was validating with scientific rigour what thousands of years of empirical observation had suggested. The specific arc from ancient shamanic use to modern medical legalisation is one of the more remarkable stories in the history of any substance. Cannabis went from the Scythian felt tent to the modern dispensary, with thousands of years of medical, ritual, cultural and recreational use in between. Chapter 15. The Answer. When did they really start? We have travelled a very long way from that field in Central Asia where we started. Now it is time to answer the question that brought us here. When did people first start smoking weed? The honest answer is, we don't know exactly, and the timeline keeps getting pushed back as new evidence emerges. What we do know is this. The oldest direct chemical evidence of psychoactive cannabis use, the 2019 Jerzankal Cemetery discovery, dates to approximately 500 BCE. But this is almost certainly not the beginning of the practice. The specific high-potency cannabis found at that site suggests that by 500 BCE, cannabis plants were already being selectively cultivated or specifically sourced for their psychoactive properties, a level of sophistication that does not emerge overnight. The practice was already established, already refined, already institutionalized into specific ritual contexts. The textual evidence, the Shenong Benkao Jing, the Vedic references, the Scythian accounts in Herodotus, pushes the confirmed awareness of cannabis's psychoactive properties back to somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 years ago in multiple independent traditions. The Chinese, Indian and Central Asian traditions were not, for the most part, in contact with each other when they independently documented cannabis's psychoactive properties, which suggests that the discovery of these properties was not a single event that diffused from a single point, but something closer to multiple independent discoveries of properties that the plant had been advertising in its biochemistry for as long as it had been growing near human communities. The genetic evidence for selective breeding of drug-type cannabis varieties, beginning approximately 12,000 years ago, is the most startling data point. if true, and it is based on sophisticated genetic analysis that is being actively refined, it would push the timeline of deliberate psychoactive cannabis use to the very dawn of the Neolithic period, to the same era as the domestication of wheat and the beginning of settled agriculture. This would mean that cannabis's psychoactive properties were among the first agricultural properties that humans systematically selected for, that at the same time humans were learning to deliberately cultivate the plants that would feed civilization. Some of them were also learning to deliberately cultivate the plant that would alter consciousness. This should not surprise us. The human desire to alter consciousness, to step outside the specific confines of ordinary experience, to access different states of mind for different purposes, is one of the most consistent features of human culture across time and geography. Every human culture that has been documented has its specific vehicles for altering consciousness. The specific substances vary. The desire is constant. Cannabis, encountered by nomadic humans in Central Asia at some point in the deep past, offered something unusual among the consciousness-altering substances available in the ancient world. It was relatively safe. The specific lethality of a cannabis overdose, unlike alcohol or many other psychoactive plants, is essentially zero. It was reliably effective, and it was easy to grow. These characteristics made it not merely a substance that humans used, but a plant that humans and human cultures incorporated into their fundamental practices: medical, religious, agricultural, social. The specific moment when the first human being deliberately inhaled cannabis smoke and recognized that something interesting was happening is lost to time. It was probably not a single moment, but a series of discoveries, made independently, in different places by different people, over a span of thousands of years. The Scythian shaman in their felt tent, the Indian sadhu in the Himalayan foothills, the ancient Chinese herbalist noting that the plant's flowers had specific properties that the seeds and fiber did not, the Egyptian or Israelite priest burning incense in a temple, perhaps not fully understanding what the specific ingredient in the mixture was doing. All of them arrived at the same place: the recognition that this specific plant, consumed in specific ways, produced specific experiences that were worth having for pain relief, worth having for the specific states of consciousness that ritual and religious practice sought to achieve, worth having for the specific social pleasure of shared intoxication, worth having, sometimes, simply because the specific quality of the experience was genuinely interesting. Chapter 16. The Hangover. What medieval people actually knew about morning after suffering and how they managed it. The morning after has always existed, not the specific morning after mythology of the modern cultural imagination, not the specific comedy film hangover of the person waking in the wrong city with the specific narrative amnesia of the plot device, the specific physiological morning after, the headache that begins behind the eyes and radiates outward with the specific pulsing insistence of the blood vessels that the alcohol's metabolic aftermath has dilated beyond their comfortable range. The nausea that the acetaldehyde, the specific toxic intermediate of ethanol metabolism, produces as it accumulates in the bloodstream faster than the liver can process it. The specific dehydration of the body that has spent the night processing a substance that is, among other things, a powerful diuretic. These specific physiological events were occurring in medieval bodies the morning after the harvest feast, and the tavern evening and the wedding celebration, and every other occasion that the medieval calendar supplied for the specific consumption of ale and mead and wine in quantities that the body's specific metabolic capacity found excessive. The medieval person who woke with the specific grey morning light coming through the unglazed window of the specific cold room with the specific complete certainty that the previous evening had been a mistake was experiencing the identical physiological events as the modern person in the identical situation. The specific biology had not changed, only the setting had. What had also not changed was the human desire to make the specific suffering stop as quickly as possible. The medieval hangover cure tradition was extensive, empirically derived, and, in some cases, considerably more pharmacologically sophisticated than the modern person's instinctive reach for the paracetamol and the full English breakfast. The specific approach to the hangover in the medieval tradition drew on both the specific medical theory of the period, the humoral framework that understood the hangover as a specific humoral imbalance produced by the specific hot and moist excess of the alcohol, and the specific empirical knowledge that specific preparations produce specific relief for specific symptoms. The most consistent hangover cure in the medieval textual tradition was the continuation of the hair of the dog, the specific small amount of additional alcohol that the medieval morning recovery tradition recommended as the first intervention. This was not the specific moral failure of the person who couldn't stop drinking. It was the specific pharmacological intervention of the person who understood, at the empirical level without the biochemical vocabulary, that the specific suffering of the hangover was produced by the abrupt cessation of alcohol rather than by its presence, and that a small amount of continued alcohol could moderate the transition from the intoxicated to the sober state. The pharmacological reality behind this folk understanding is genuine. The hangover's specific worst symptoms, the specific anxiety, the specific tremulousness, the specific exaggerated startle response, are symptoms of the mild alcohol withdrawal that the regular drinker experiences the morning after, substantial consumption, as the nervous system that has adapted to alcohol's presence reasserts its baseline excitability in the alcohol's absence. A small amount of additional alcohol the following morning does genuinely moderate these withdrawal symptoms, that the cure creates the specific conditions for its own repetition the following morning, the specific cycle of the dependent drinker that the hair of the dog tradition enabled, was the specific problem with the specific solution that the medieval tradition did not fully reckon with. The specific herbal hangover cures of the medieval tradition were the cures of the specific symptoms rather than the underlying cause, the same approach that modern hangover remedies generally take, without the specific biochemical framework to articulate why. Willow bark preparations, whose salicylate content provides genuine anti-inflammatory and analgesic effects, were used for the specific headache. Ginger preparations, whose specific anti-nausea properties the modern pharmaceutical tradition has confirmed in specific clinical trials, were used for the specific gastric distress. The specific mint preparations, whose specific cooling and antispasmodic properties made them useful for nausea and headache, were a consistent feature of the medieval morning recovery tradition. The drinking of substantial quantities of water, the specific rehydration that the dehydrated hangover body requires, was recommended in the medieval tradition with the specific caveat that the water source mattered, and that the specific contaminated water sources of the medieval town were not the specific remedy for the specific dehydration of the morning after. The specific ale that the tradition recommended as the morning drink was the small ale, the specific low-alcohol everyday beverage rather than the strong ale of the previous evening, providing both the mild pharmacological moderation of the withdrawal and the specific liquid volume that the dehydration required, without the specific contamination risk of the water source. The food tradition for the morning after was the food tradition of the specific nutrients that the depleted body required. The specific emphasis on meat, on the protein and fat of the morning meal, reflected both the general medieval preference for meat as the restorative food and the specific nutritional depletion of the body that had spent the night processing alcohol rather than absorbing nutrients. The broth, the specific nutrient-rich liquid of the simmered bones and vegetables, was the specific morning-after food of the person too nauseated for solid food, providing the specific amino acids and minerals that the depleted body needed in the specific easily absorbed liquid form. The specific sweating cure of the hangover tradition, the recommendation to seek the warmth of the fire or the bathhouse and sweat out the effects of the previous night, reflected the specific humoral theory that the excess of the hot and moist humour produced by alcohol needed to be expelled through the specific mechanism of perspiration. The physiological reality is more complicated. Sweating does not directly remove acetaldehyde from the bloodstream at a meaningful rate, but the specific warmth of the bathhouse and the specific relaxation that the warm environment produced were genuine comfort interventions for the specific misery of the hangover, and the specific bathhouse visit was the specific social acknowledgement that the morning after state was a known and manageable condition rather than a specific, personal, moral catastrophe. The specific relationship between the hangover and the medieval religious week reveals one of the more interesting specific intersections of the pharmacological and the theological in the period's daily life. Sunday was the specific day of rest and religious observance that followed Saturday's specific, potential evening of recreation and consumption. The specific medieval practice of attending Mass on Sunday morning in whatever state the Saturday night had left the attendee in, was a specific weekly test of the specific ability to perform the specific religious obligation under the specific physical conditions of the hangover. The specific accommodation that the church made for this reality, the specific ways in which the pastoral tradition managed the specific reality that a substantial portion of its Sunday morning congregation was in varying states of the morning after, was the accommodation of the practical institution managing the specific human reality of its community. The priest who smelled ale on his congregation's breath at the Sunday morning Mass was not the priest conducting a moral emergency. He was the priest conducting a service in the specific morning after social reality of the medieval community he served, and the specific pastoral tradition had the specific accommodation for this reality that the specific rigid moralism of the prescriptive literature would not always suggest. Chapter 17. The Children of the Poppy. How medieval parents used opiates on their children and what actually happened. The specific subject of this chapter is one that the modern reader will find immediately alarming, and the specific honesty of this script requires both acknowledging the alarm and providing the specific context that prevents it from becoming the specific, anachronistic condemnation of the past for failing to know what we know now. Medieval parents gave their children opiates, not in the specific criminal sense of the deliberate harm, not in the specific context of the abuse that the modern safeguarding framework is designed to prevent, in the specific medical and practical context of the parents who were applying the best available pharmaceutical knowledge of their specific period to the specific medical problems of the specific children in their care. The results were sometimes the results of the medication working as intended. They were sometimes the results of the medication working considerably more powerfully than intended, and they were occasionally the results that the specific, narrow therapeutic window of the opiate preparations produced when the specific pediatric pharmacokinetics that the medieval tradition did not understand created the specific overdose that the adult dose administered to the child's smaller body represents. The most common context for opiate administration to medieval children was the context of pain. The specific dental pain of the developing child, the teething of the infant, the specific agonizing toothache of the child whose specific diet's grit was already working on the enamel of their adult teeth, was addressed by the specific opiate preparations that the medieval pharmacopoeia made available for this purpose. The preparations described in the medieval sources, the specific small amount of the opium-containing compound rubbed on the gums or administered in a liquid vehicle, were calibrated for adult use and administered to children with the specific imprecise judgment that the absence of weight-based dosing produced. The specific soporific preparations given to infants to induce sleep, the medieval equivalent of the Victorian era's soothing syrups that we discussed in the heroin history script, were a consistent feature of the medieval domestic pharmacopoeia. The specific exhausted medieval parent who needed the infant to sleep, while the specific agricultural work of the season demanded their presence, was the specific human situation that the soporific preparation addressed, and the specific practical reality that the infant needed to sleep and the specific work needed to be done was the specific pressing circumstance that made the specific preparation attractive regardless of the specific risks that the specific doses involved. The specific opiates were not the only soporific preparation available for children. The anticholinergic preparations, the henbane and the mandrake that we have discussed throughout this script, were also used in pediatric contexts, with the specific risks that their specific, narrow therapeutic window and the specific sensitivity of the child's nervous system combined to produce. The specific child who received the adult dose of the henbane preparation experienced the specific anticholinergic effects that the adult experienced, amplified by the specific weight-based excess of the dose. The specific signs of the resulting state, the dilated pupils, the flushing, the specific agitated then deeply sedated progression of the anticholinergic overdose, were the specific signs that the experienced practitioner recognized as the need for the specific reversal interventions that the medieval tradition had developed. The specific, medieval, awareness of the pediatric risk of these preparations is documented in the texts, with the specific detail of the tradition that had seen the consequences of the miscalculated dose. The specific warnings in the medical literature about the administration of soporific preparations to children, the specific recommendations for reduced doses, The specific signs to watch for that indicated excessive effect are the specific evidence of a tradition that had developed the specific caution through the specific experience of the specific outcomes that incaution produced. The wet nurse was the specific figure whose pharmacological practices most directly affected the infant in the specific way that the medieval medical tradition was most anxious about. The wet nurse who consumed specific substances, the ale, the herbal preparations, the opiate compounds, was the wet nurse whose specific consumption affected the specific milk, whose specific pharmacological properties were transmitted to the nursing infant through the specific mechanism that the medical tradition understood at the level of the humoral theory. The specific transfer of alcohol and opiate compounds into breast milk, which is pharmacologically real and measurable by modern analytical standards, was understood by the medieval tradition through the specific humoral framework of the milk as transformed blood, whose specific quality was affected by the specific substances the nurse consumed. The specific recommendations in the medical literature about the nurse's diet, the specific prohibitions on strong ale, on specific herbs, on the various preparations that the medical tradition identified as potentially harmful to the nursing infant through the milk, were the specific practical medical guidance of the tradition that had observed the specific outcomes of the specific practices. The specific outcome that concerned the medieval medical tradition most in the context of the wet nurse was the specific outcome of the infant who was too sedated, the specific dangerously quiet infant who did not cry, who did not demand feeding, who slept with the specific excessive depth that the over-medicated body produces. The specific medieval medical recognition that the excessively quiet infant was the medical emergency, rather than the convenient infant, was the specific clinical wisdom of the tradition that had seen the specific outcome of the missed feeding, the specific dehydration of the infant who did not wake to nurse, the specific death of the infant whose specific sedation had crossed the specific line between sleep and the permanent absence of consciousness. Chapter 18. The Plague Years. How the Black Death changed the medieval relationship with consciousness-altering substances. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347. By the time it had run its initial course through the early 1350s, between a third and a half of the European population was dead. In specific regions, specific cities, specific villages, specific communities, the mortality was higher. The specific social, economic and psychological devastation of this event was of a magnitude that the medieval world had no framework adequate to process, and the specific attempts to process it, the specific theological responses, the specific medical responses, the specific social and behavioral responses, are among the most revealing documents of the human encounter with catastrophe at the extreme end of the possible scale. The specific relationship between the Black Death and the medieval consciousness-altering substance culture is a relationship that has not been discussed with the specific attention it deserves. Because the specific catastrophe of the plague years did not simply kill people and leave the survivors intact. It transformed the specific relationship of the survivors with almost every aspect of their social and cultural world, including the specific pharmacological dimension of how they managed their specific psychological and physical experience of being the people who had not died when everyone around them was dying. The specific psychological consequences of mass bereavement at the scale of the plague's mortality, the specific individual and collective trauma of the person who had watched their specific family, their specific community, their specific world dissolve in the specific weeks of the plague's passage through their specific location, are consequences that the medieval world processed through the specific available frameworks of the specific period, the theological framework of God's punishment and the specific penitential response it demanded, the medical framework of the specific miasmatic theory that attributed the plague to specific corruptions of the air and the specific environmental interventions that could counter them, and the specific pharmacological framework of the substances that provided the specific temporary relief from the specific overwhelming experience of the surviving the unsurvivable, the specific spike in recorded ale consumption in the plague years and their immediate aftermath is one of the most consistent patterns in the specific economic records of the period. The specific alehouse receipts, the specific grain consumption records, the specific indirect evidence of the brewing industry's specific activity all point in the specific direction of the surviving population consuming more ale than it had before the plague. The specific interpretation of this pattern, the specific question of whether it represents the specific grief response of the traumatized survivor, or the specific rational behavior of the person who has observed that the next day is not guaranteed, is a question that the specific documentary record does not resolve with precision, but the specific human psychology of the catastrophic loss makes both explanations plausible simultaneously. The specific flagellant movement, the specific spectacular procession of the people who whipped themselves publicly as specific penitential response to the plague's visitation, was not a pharmacological phenomenon in any direct sense, but the specific endorphin release of the sustained self-inflicted pain that the flagellant practice involved was the specific physiological event that contemporary accounts of the flagellant state, the specific ecstatic quality of the prolonged flagellant procession, the specific altered consciousness of the participants, consistently describe. The specific extreme physical stimulus of the self-inflicted wound activates the same specific opioid receptors that the exogenous opiates activate, and the specific altered state that the flagellants described was at least partly the specific physiological state of the endogenous opioid system at maximum activation. The specific medical response to the plague, the specific attempts by physicians and apothecaries to develop specific preparations that prevented or treated the specific disease, produced a specific expansion of the specific pharmacological experimentation of the period. The specific urgency of the plague produced the specific desperation of the practitioner, who had no adequate tool and who was willing to try anything that offered specific hope. The specific theoriac preparations of the established medical tradition were applied in specific increased quantities. The specific new preparations of specific purported antimiasmatic properties were developed and distributed with the specific commercial speed of the crisis that creates specific demand for specific solutions regardless of specific evidence of efficacy. The specific poppy preparations were among the most widely deployed in the plague context, not because opium treated the plague in any specific medical sense, but because the specific palliative management of the plague's worst symptoms, the specific pain, the specific fever, the specific respiratory distress of the pneumonic form, was the specific medical intervention that the tradition could most reliably provide. The specific dying person who received the opium preparation was not being cured. They were being made as comfortable as the specific pharmacological resources of the medieval tradition could make them, in the specific understanding that the comfort of the dying was itself a specific medical and spiritual service. The specific long-term psychological effects of the plague on the surviving population's relationship with consciousness alteration were the effects of the specific collective trauma on the specific relationship with the present moment that the catastrophe produced. The specific cultural phenomenon that historians describe as the post-plague relaxation of moral strictures, the specific documented increase in the specific consumption of luxury goods, the specific documented increase in the specific recreational activities that the pre-plague moral framework had constrained, reflects the specific psychological reality of the person who has survived the specific demonstration that the future is not guaranteed, the specific philosophy of the immediate pleasure, the specific carpe diem of the post-plague cultural moment that the specific texts of the period express with the specific frankness of the tradition that has recently been reminded of its mortality with unusual vividness, was the specific cultural response that shaped the specific behaviors of the surviving population in ways that included the specific increased consumption of the specific consciousness-altering substances that the specific medieval landscape provided. Chapter 19, The Holy Drunk, the specific intersection of alcohol and spiritual experience in medieval religious life. There was a category of religious experience in the medieval Christian tradition that was specifically described in the language of intoxication. The specific mystical theology of the medieval period returned repeatedly to the specific vocabulary of wine and drunkenness to describe the specific states of union with the divine that the mystical tradition sought. Bernard of Clairvaux, the specific 12th century Cistercian abbot whose specific mystical theology was among the most influential of the medieval period, wrote about the soul's experience of divine love in the specific vocabulary of inebriation. Mechtild of Magdeburg, the specific 13th century Beguine whose specific visions are among the most vivid documents of medieval female mysticism, described her specific experience of the divine presence in terms that are explicitly and specifically intoxicant. Meister Eckhart, the specific Dominican theologian whose specific mystical speculation on the soul's union with God pushed the medieval theological tradition toward its specific outer limits, used the specific language of the specific inebriation to describe the specific state of the soul that has penetrated beyond the specific multiplicity of creation to the specific unity of the divine ground. The specific question that this vocabulary raises, whether the specific mystical intoxication of the medieval theological tradition was purely metaphorical, or whether the specific theological metaphor reflected specific pharmacological experience, is a question that the straightforward answer oversimplifies in both directions. The specific use of wine in the medieval religious ceremony was genuinely inebriating in specific contexts. The Eucharistic wine of the priest, who consumed the entire chalice, including the portion destined for the congregation in the specific pre-Fourth Lateran Council practice and the specific variations of practice that different communities maintained, was consumed in specific quantities that the specific alcoholic content of medieval wine made potentially intoxicating. The specific liturgical ceremony in which the priest consumed the wine was not a ceremony designed for inebriation, but the specific physiological effect of the specific quantity of wine consumed in the specific fasting state that the priestly liturgical practice required was the specific physiological effect of alcohol on the empty stomach of the person who had been fasting since the previous evening. The specific monastic tradition of the daily communal wine consumption, the specific Benedictine rules provision for a specific daily allowance of wine, created the specific pharmacological baseline of the monastic community's daily experience. The specific amount, roughly a hemina, approximately 1/4 of a litre, consumed daily was the specific amount that would produce a consistent, mild pharmacological effect in most adult drinkers, and the specific consistency of the daily consumption created the specific pharmacological baseline of the regular drinker's experience, rather than the specific dramatic intoxication of the occasional feast. The specific sacred quality attributed to the wine in the Eucharistic context was the specific theological loading of a pharmacologically active substance with the specific meaning of the divine encounter that made the specific consumption of that substance a specific portal to the altered state that the specific theological framework identified as the divine presence. The specific psychology of the Eucharistic encounter, the specific expectation of the divine presence, the specific ritual preparation, the specific sensory environment of the medieval liturgy, created the specific conditions in which even the modest pharmacological effect of the small quantity of wine consumed in the Eucharistic context could be amplified by the specific psychological expectation into the specific experience of the altered state that the specific mystical theology described. The specific abuse of the Eucharistic wine, the specific problem of the priest who consumed more of the consecrated wine than the specific liturgical ceremony required, whether through the specific thirst of the celebrant or the specific anxiety of the person for whom the specific experience of the Eucharist was the specific experience of the pharmacological comfort that the wine provided, was a specific pastoral problem that the medieval church addressed with the specific consistency of the institution managing the specific human behaviours that its specific practices enabled. The specific Desert Father tradition of the early church, whose specific ascetic practices the medieval monastery had inherited in modified form, included the specific deliberate use of the hunger, the thirst, the specific physical deprivation of the ascetic life as tools for the specific induction of the altered states that the tradition understood as mystical experience. The specific neuroscience of fasting-induced altered states, the specific changes in glucose metabolism, the specific ketosis, the specific neurological modifications of extended fasting, was not available to the medieval tradition, but the specific empirical observation that the specific extended fast produced the specific altered quality of consciousness that the mystical tradition valued was a specific empirical knowledge that the tradition had developed through the specific practice of the people who had fasted for specific periods and recorded what the specific fasting produced. The specific complementary tradition of the feast, the specific deliberate alternation of the fast and the feast that the medieval liturgical calendar built into the specific rhythm of the year, was the specific pharmacological oscillation between the specific depletion of the fast and the specific repletion of the feast that the tradition had identified as productive of specific heightened awareness. The specific Easter feast after the Lenten fast, the specific Christmas celebration after the Advent, the specific intensity of the feast experience that the fast had prepared the participant for through the specific neurological priming of the depleted state. Chapter 20. The specifics of smell. How incense, aromatics, and the burned substance altered medieval consciousness. The medieval church was designed to do something specific to the people who entered it, not only in the specific architectural sense of the soaring vault and the coloured glass that produced the specific visual experience of the encounter with the transcendent, in the specific olfactory sense of the incense that burned throughout the specific liturgical ceremony and that produced the specific chemical environment of the enclosed stone space in which the specific congregation gathered for the specific religious practice of the medieval community. The incense of the medieval church was not merely ceremonial decoration, it was a specific pharmacological intervention in the specific consciousness of the specific congregation, whether or not the specific practitioners of the tradition understood it in those terms, which, in the specific vocabulary of the humoral medical tradition, they partially did. The specific compounds in the incense preparations of the medieval church, the frankincense, the myrrh, the specific aromatic resins and herbs of the liturgical tradition, contain specific pharmacologically active volatile compounds whose specific inhalation in the specific quantities produced by the burning of incense in the specific, enclosed space of the medieval church created the specific chemical environment whose specific neurological effects have been the subject of specific modern pharmacological investigation. Frankincense, the specific resin of the boswellia tree whose specific combustion produces the specific white smoke and the specific distinctive aroma of the Christian liturgical tradition, contains incensal acetate, a compound that specific modern research has found produces specific anxiolytic and mildly euphoric effects through specific mechanisms involving the brain's TRPV 3-ion channels. The specific study that demonstrated this, published in the specific peer-reviewed journal FASEB in 2008, found that inhaled incensal acetate produced specific anti-anxiety and mood-elevating effects in the specific animal models tested, consistent with the specific traditional understanding of frankincense as a substance that produced specific conducive states for specific ritual and contemplative practice. The specific cumulative effect of the regular church attendance in the specific incense-saturated environment of the medieval liturgy, the specific weekly or more frequent exposure to the specific psychoactive volatile compounds of the burning incense in the specific enclosed space of the specific stone building, was the specific pharmacological contribution to the specific religious experience of the medieval congregation that the theological tradition attributed entirely to the specific divine presence, and that the pharmacological tradition recognizes as a specific additional dimension of the specific experience. The monastery garden's specific use of aromatic plants in the specific contemplative spaces of the cloister walk was the specific outdoor version of the same principle. The specific deliberate placement of the specific aromatic plants in the specific locations, where the specific monk's daily contemplative practice occurred, was the specific intentional creation of the specific olfactory environment that the specific tradition had identified as conducive to the specific states of awareness that the contemplative practice aimed at. Lavender, whose specific anxiolytic properties have been confirmed in specific modern clinical trials, was among the specific most extensively used aromatics of the medieval contemplative tradition. The specific compounds in lavender, the linalool and the linaloyl acetate, whose specific mechanisms of action in the specific nervous system have been investigated in specific modern pharmacological research, produce specific sedative and anxiolytic effects that the medieval tradition had identified empirically through the specific observation of the specific effects of the specific plant in specific contexts. The burned herb was the specific, most potent form of the olfactory pharmacology. The specific combustion of the specific plant material that released the specific volatile compounds in the specific concentrated form that the smoke delivered to the specific respiratory surfaces of the person in the specific proximity of the specific fire. The specific practice of burning specific herbs in the specific context of the specific ritual, the specific folk tradition of the burned sage, the specific Christian tradition of the burned incense, the specific healer's tradition of the burned antimicrobial herbs in the sick room, was the specific delivery mechanism for the specific pharmacological effects that the specific volatile compounds in the specific plant material produced in the specific concentration achieved through combustion. The specific relationship between the scented oil, the specific anointing preparations of the medieval religious and medical tradition, and the specific olfactory pharmacology was the relationship of the topical application of the specific volatile compounds to the specific skin surfaces from which they could be absorbed in the specific concentration that the oil vehicle produced. The specific anointing of the sick in the specific religious ceremony of the last rites was simultaneously a specific theological act and a specific pharmacological one. The specific aromatics of the anointing oil providing the specific compounds whose specific inhalation from the specific surface of the skin produced the specific physiological effects that the medieval medical tradition understood as beneficial to the specific condition of the person being anointed. Chapter 21. The poisoned mistaken for medicine. The specific cases where medieval pharmacology went catastrophically wrong, the medieval practitioner sometimes killed the patient, not through malice, not through the specific deliberate harm of the person who compounds the specific lethal dose with the specific intent of producing the specific death of the specific patient, through the specific ignorance that the specific insufficient scientific framework produced, when the specific narrow therapeutic window of the specific potent preparation was not adequately respected, or when the specific individual variability in the pharmacokinetic processing of the specific compound produced the specific outcome that the specific standard dose did not produce in most patients, but produced with specific fatal reliability in this specific one. The specific case studies that the medieval medical literature preserves cautiously, incompletely through the specific filter of the tradition that preferred to document successes rather than failures, are the specific evidence of the specific places where the specific pharmacological knowledge of the period encountered the specific limits of what the empirical tradition could reliably manage. The mandrake death was the most documented category of the specific pharmaceutical fatality in the medieval record. The specific root, whose specific variable alkaloid content meant that specific plants from specific locations, at specific stages of specific growth, contained specific concentrations of the specific tropane alkaloids that varied enough between samples to make the specific standard dose an unreliable guide, produced the specific overdose often enough that the specific medical literature addressed it specifically. The specific signs of the specific overdose, the specific progression from sedation to coma to the specific cessation of the respiratory drive that the anticholinergic toxidrome produces at its most severe, were documented in the specific texts with the specific detail of the tradition that had encountered these signs and had developed the specific responses that the specific emergency required. The specific treatment for the mandrake overdose that the medieval tradition developed, the specific strong stimulants, the specific enforced wakefulness, the specific application of vinegar and strong-smelling substances under the nose, was the specific pre-pharmacological version of the specific supportive care that modern management of anticholinergic overdose still employs in its essential character. The specific urge to keep the patient awake, the specific application of the specific sensory stimuli that countered the specific sedation of the overdose, was the specific clinical insight that the tradition had developed through the specific observation of the outcomes of the specific cases where the intervention had and had not been applied in time. The ergot cases were the specific category of the unintentional pharmacological catastrophe on the largest scale, the specific mass poisoning events that the specific contaminated grain produced throughout the medieval period. The specific record of these events in the medieval chronicle tradition is the specific record of the community that was poisoned by its own staple food without knowing it was poisoned, that experienced the specific collective altered state of the ergotism and interpreted it in the specific available terms of the specific theological framework, and that suffered the specific individual consequences, the gangrenous limb, the convulsive death, the the specific blindness of the optic nerve compression that severe ergotism produced, that the specific alkaloids caused when the specific dose was high enough and the specific duration of consumption was long enough. The specific modern retrospective diagnosis of ergotism in the specific medieval plague and epidemic records is one of the specific areas where the specific pharmacological history of the medieval period intersects most directly with the specific mainstream historiography of medieval disease. The specific epidemics that the medieval chronicles recorded, the specific episodes of mass illness with the specific combination of the specific neurological and vascular symptoms have been analysed by specific modern historians and specific modern clinicians and found to be consistent with the specific diagnosis of the ergotism in a substantial proportion of the specific cases. The aconite deaths were the specific category of fatal poisoning whose specific mechanism, the specific cardiac arrhythmia that the aconitine, alkaloids of the monkshood plant produced through the specific sodium channel interaction that the specific modern cardiac pharmacology has elucidated, was the specific, rapid, and irreversible pharmacological event that made the specific aconite poisoning the specific, most reliably lethal of the medieval accidental pharmacological catastrophes. The specific plants of the aconite family, the monkshood, the wolfsbane, grew in specific locations in the medieval European landscape, were used in specific small doses in the specific veterinary tradition for specific purposes, and were involved in the specific fatal human exposures that the specific records of medieval coroner equivalent proceedings document with the specific matter-of-fact tone of the institution that encountered such events with the specific regularity of the world before toxicological awareness. The specific category of the mistaken identity, the specific preparation of the specific toxic plant in the specific erroneous belief that it was the specific non-toxic plant it resembled, was the specific botanical confusion whose consequences ranged from the specific uncomfortable to the specific lethal, depending on the specific toxic potential of the specific mistaken plant. The specific resemblance between the wild carrot and the hemlock, both members of the Apiaceae family, both presenting the specific white-flowered umbel of the family in the specific stages of growth at which they were most likely to be harvested, was the specific botanical confusion that the specific medical records of multiple periods and multiple cultures document as the source of the specific hemlock poisoning that the specific folk and medical tradition attributed to specific misidentification. Chapter 22. The Gender of Intoxication. How medieval culture differently judged the altered states of men and women. The medieval double standard regarding consciousness, alteration was not subtle. The specific man who drank substantially at the harvest feast was the man performing the specific social ritual of the masculine communal celebration. The specific participation in the specific tradition of the communal intoxication that the specific agricultural calendar provided as the specific legitimate occasion for the specific altered state. The specific woman who drank the same amount at the same feast was the woman who was failing the specific expectations of the specific feminine propriety that the medieval social framework maintained for women, with the specific consistency of the tradition that defined feminine virtue in the specific terms that male intoxication violated and female intoxication violated more. The specific difference in the specific social consequences of the specific same behaviour was the specific expression of the specific medieval gender framework in the specific domain of consciousness alteration. The drunk man was the man who had celebrated too enthusiastically. The drunk woman was the woman who had abandoned the specific moral self-regulation that the specific feminine virtue required. The specific difference in the specific moral vocabulary applied to the specific identical behaviour was the specific difference that the specific medieval gender ideology maintained across the specific full range of the social world, and the specific domain of intoxication was one of the places where it was most clearly and most consistently expressed. The specific theological framework reinforced the specific social framework with the specific arguments of the specific medieval moral theology. The specific female body was understood in the specific humoral tradition as the specific body more susceptible to the specific passions, more prone to the specific irrational behaviours that the specific excess of the moist and cold humours that the female constitution was understood to involve, the specific alcohol's effect on the specific control that the rational faculty exercised over the specific passions, was understood as particularly dangerous in the specific body that was already specifically vulnerable to the specific passions that the specific masculine reason could more reliably control. The alewife, the specific female brewer, whose specific commercial production of the specific everyday drink was the specific economic foundation of the specific medieval brewing tradition, occupied the specific, ambiguous social position of the woman who was legitimately producing the substance that the specific moral tradition condemned when consumed in excess, and who was specifically suspected of the specific fraudulent practices, the watered ale, the short measure, the specific adulterated preparation, that the specific regulatory tradition addressed through the specific assize of ale. The specific suspicion that attached to the alewife was the specific suspicion of the woman who controlled the specific substance whose specific effects the community both valued and feared, and the specific regulatory attention that the alewife received was the specific institutional management of the specific anxiety that her specific commercial power over the specific intoxicant produced. The specific iconography of the alewife in the specific medieval popular culture, the specific depiction of the dishonest alewife being dragged to hell in the specific morality tradition of the period's visual culture, was the specific cultural expression of the specific anxiety about the woman who made the ale, sold the ale, and potentially modified the ale with the specific additional ingredients of the specific folk pharmacological tradition. The witch, the specific figure of the most intense medieval pharmacological anxiety, was overwhelmingly female in the specific demographic pattern of the witch trial prosecutions. The specific women who were burned for the specific possession and use of the specific consciousness-altering preparations we have discussed throughout this script were the specific female practitioners of the specific knowledge tradition that the specific institutional framework of the late medieval period found most threatening. The specific targeting of women in the witch trials was not coincidental to the specific pharmacological dimension of the accusations. The specific knowledge of the specific preparations was, in the specific medieval distribution of the specific knowledge, primarily the knowledge of women, the midwives, the wise women, the herbalists, the specific female practitioners of the folk medical tradition, whose specific gender and specific knowledge combined to make them the specific targets of the specific institutional anxiety. The specific male practitioner of the specific same knowledge was the specific apothecary, the specific physician, the specific monk, whose specific institutional position protected him from the specific accusations that the specific wise woman without institutional protection received. The specific identical pharmacological knowledge, the specific ability to compound the specific preparation that produced the specific altered state, was the specific credential of the respected professional when it resided in the specific male body with the specific institutional authorization, and the specific evidence of the diabolical compact when it resided in the specific female body without the specific institutional protection. Chapter 23. The specific joy. What medieval people actually experienced as pleasurable about the substances they used. This chapter is about pleasure, the specific pleasure of the specific altered state, not the specific pharmacological mechanism, not the specific historical context, not the specific social or theological framework, but the specific actual experience of the medieval person who felt the specific warm spreading of the opiate preparation through their specific pain-racked body, who felt the specific first ale of the evening begin to loosen the specific accumulated tension of the specific working week, who experienced the specific visual shimmer of the beginning of the ergot alkaloid's reorganization of the specific perceptual field. These were real pleasures. They were the pleasures of the specific human body's specific neurochemistry, responding to the specific compounds in ways that are among the most powerful rewards that the specific human nervous system can generate. The specific activation of the specific reward circuits that evolution had developed for the specific purpose of reinforcing the specific behaviors that promoted specific survival, hijacked by the specific pharmacological properties of the specific compounds to produce the specific reward signal without the specific survival behavior that the reward system was designed to reinforce. But they were not experienced as pharmacological events. They were experienced as pleasures, as the specific positive qualities of the specific conscious state that the specific substances produced, and the specific richness of that experience, the specific warmth of the opiate state, the specific loosening of the ale, The specific visual intensity of the psychedelic experience is the specific dimension of the medieval pharmacological landscape that the historical account most consistently underrepresents, because the historical account tends toward the documentary record of the specific, institutional response to the specific problems the substances created rather than the specific subjective experience of the person for whom they were producing the specific intended pleasure. The specific pleasure of the medieval feast drink was the specific pleasure that the medieval cultural tradition acknowledged most openly and most specifically as a legitimate good, the specific communal pleasure of the shared drink in the specific company of the specific people whose specific presence made the specific occasion worth celebrating. The specific tradition of the toast, the specific raising of the specific cup to the specific health of the specific person, the specific verbal acknowledgement of the specific relationship that the specific shared drink was honouring, was the specific cultural technology for the specific deployment of the specific pleasure of the drink in the specific service of the specific social bond that the specific community needed to maintain. The specific pleasure of the opiate state was the specific pleasure that the medieval tradition acknowledged most carefully and most ambivalently. The specific pleasure that the specific medical tradition recognized as the specific therapeutic benefit of the specific preparation, and that the specific potential for dependence the tradition also recognized made the specific pleasure dangerous in the specific way that the specific pleasures most worth having sometimes are. The medieval physician who prescribed the opiate preparation knew they were prescribing the specific relief of the specific suffering that was the specific legitimate purpose of the prescription. They also knew, because the tradition had documented it, that the specific relief produced by the specific preparation was the specific relief that the specific patient sometimes returned for beyond the specific medical justification for their specific original prescription. The specific pleasure of the psychedelic experience, the specific intense visual and emotional and cognitive reorganization that the specific ergot alkaloids and the specific mushroom alkaloids and the specific anticholinergic preparations produced in the specific people who encountered them, was the specific pleasure most difficult to discuss openly in the specific medieval cultural framework, because the specific cultural frameworks available for making sense of it were either the specific theological framework of the divine vision or the specific theological framework of the diabolical deception, and neither framework had the specific vocabulary for the purely secular phenomenology of the profoundly altered state. The specific writings that come closest to the specific phenomenology of the medieval psychedelic pleasure are the writings of the mystics, not because the mystics were necessarily using the specific preparations we have discussed, but because the specific vocabulary that the mystical tradition developed for the specific description of the specific altered states of contemplative practice was the specific vocabulary most adequate to the specific experience that the specific pharmacological altered state produced. The specific luminosity, the specific dissolution of the specific boundaries of the ordinary self, the specific sense of the specific profound significance of the specific ordinary moment. These are the specific qualities that the medieval mystical vocabulary describes and that the modern phenomenology of the psychedelic state recognizes. The specific medieval ale pleasure was the pleasure that the specific cultural tradition most directly acknowledged and most extensively documented. The specific joy of the specific evening in the specific company after the specific hard day's work, the specific loosening of the specific accumulated weight of the specific relentless physical and economic and social demands of the specific medieval life, the specific medieval literary tradition from the specific tavern scenes of the specific fabliaux to the specific drinking songs of the specific Camina Burana, preserves the specific joy of the specific ale pleasure with the specific celebratory directness of the tradition that had decided this was a legitimate and valuable human experience worth singing about. The Carmina Burana's specific drinking songs, the specific medieval Latin and vernacular poems that celebrate the specific pleasures of the specific tavern, in the specific language of the specific joy of the specific moment, are among the most vivid documents of the specific genuine pleasure of the specific medieval consciousness alteration. The specific song that translates roughly as "in the tavern," the specific poem that catalogues the specific pleasures of the specific gathering with the specific relish of the specific person who has found in the specific tavern the specific relief from the specific outside world, is the specific expression of the specific feeling that anyone who has ever found the specific comfort of the specific good company in the specific warm space with the specific good drink recognizes as the specific, genuine and legitimate pleasure that it is. Chapter 24. The Specific Inheritance. What medieval pharmacology left to the Renaissance and what the Renaissance did with it. The medieval pharmacological tradition did not end cleanly. No tradition ends cleanly. The specific medieval approach to consciousness-altering substances, the specific integration of the pharmacological and the theological, the specific empirical knowledge of the folk tradition, the specific formal knowledge of the medical tradition, the specific commercial knowledge of the apothecary, transformed rather than terminated as the specific cultural moment of the Renaissance and the Reformation, reshaped the specific intellectual and institutional landscape of European culture. The specific transformation happened through several specific mechanisms. The printing press, introduced to Europe in the 1450s and producing printed books in significant quantities by the 1470s, transformed the specific relationship between knowledge and its preservation and transmission in ways that directly affected the pharmaceutical tradition. The specific oral knowledge of the wise woman's tradition was not the tradition that the printing press preserved. It preserved the specific written tradition, the herbals, the pharmacopoeias, the medical textbooks, of the specific literate male practitioners whose specific institutional position gave them the specific access to the specific technology of the printed word. The specific printed herbals of the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the specific herbarium of Apuleius Platonicus, the specific Ortus Sanitatis, the specific later works of Otto Brunfels and Leonhard Fuchs, were the specific documents through which the specific accumulated botanical and pharmacological knowledge of the medieval tradition entered the specific printed culture of the early modern period. The specific knowledge they preserved was the specific knowledge of the plants and their properties, including the specific pharmacological properties of the specific psychoactive plants that we have discussed throughout this script, combined with the specific woodcut illustrations that represented the specific visual identification tradition that the oral botanical culture had relied on. The specific Reformation's impact on the specific medieval pharmacological tradition was the impact of the specific institutional disruption of the specific religious structures that had been the specific primary custodians of the specific formal pharmaceutical knowledge. The specific dissolution of the monasteries, in England and in the specific Protestant territories of the continent, was the specific removal of the specific institutional knowledge infrastructure that the specific monastic tradition had maintained. The specific monastery gardens with their specific cultivation of the specific medicinal plants, the specific infirmary libraries with the specific pharmaceutical texts, the specific practical knowledge of the specific herbalist monks and nuns. These were the specific institutional casualties of the specific religious disruption that the Reformation produced. The specific Paracelsian revolution in medicine, the specific challenge to the humoral tradition mounted by the specific Swiss physician and natural philosopher Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, who called himself Paracelsus, was the specific intellectual disruption that most directly challenged the specific theoretical framework within which the medieval pharmacological tradition had operated. Paracelsus's specific rejection of the classical humoral theory in favour of a specific chemical understanding of disease and treatment, the specific proposal that the specific diseases had specific chemical causes and required specific chemical treatments, was the specific intellectual precursor of the specific modern pharmaceutical tradition. But Paracelsus did not reject the substances, he reformulated them. The specific laudanum that Paracelsus formalized, the specific opium in alcohol preparation that bore his specific name and became the specific standard opiate preparation of the early modern period, was the specific chemical formalization of the specific preparation that the medieval tradition had been making in various specific forms throughout the preceding centuries. The specific theriac that the medieval tradition had valued was subjected to the specific Paracelsian critique of the complex compound medicine, but the specific opium that gave the theriac its specific primary pharmaceutical efficacy survived the critique and the formalization as the specific, canonical preparation of the subsequent centuries. The specific alchemical tradition of the late medieval and early Renaissance period was the specific intellectual context in which the specific pursuit of the specific consciousness-altering substance was most explicitly framed as the specific philosophical project. The specific alchemist's pursuit of the specific philosophical mercury, the specific transformative substance that would transmute the base metal to gold, and the specific mortal body to the specific, immortal perfection of the specific philosophical completion was not primarily a practical pharmacological project, but the specific alchemical laboratory was the specific space in which the specific compounds were produced and tested, and the specific alchemical tradition's specific interest in the specific properties of the specific substances it worked with produced the specific, practical pharmacological observations that the specific early modern chemistry would eventually formalize. The specific distillation technology that the alchemical tradition developed was the specific, technical advance that transformed the specific relationship between the plant pharmacopoeia and the specific concentrated preparations that the specific distillation could produce. The specific essential oils, the specific concentrated volatile compounds of the specific aromatic plants, were the specific products of the specific alchemical distillation tradition, whose specific pharmacological properties were the specific concentrated versions of the specific properties of the whole plants that the medieval tradition had used in their specific non-concentrated forms. Conclusion: 10,000 years and counting. You are back in the field, but now you know more about it than you did at the beginning. The human standing in front of the tall, distinctive plant is not simply an anonymous ancient person making a random agricultural decision. They are the heir to an evolutionary history that goes back millions of years, standing at the beginning of a cultural history that will span 10,000 years and eventually encompass virtually every human society on Earth. They are about to make a decision whose consequences they cannot possibly anticipate, and whose consequences we are still living with. The history of cannabis is, in miniature, a history of the human relationship with the natural world, the ways in which we have systematically explored what the plants around us can do, the ways in which we have incorporated that knowledge into medicine, religion, culture, and daily life, and the ways in which our relationship with specific substances has been shaped and reshaped by the specific political and cultural forces of each era. It is also a history that's still being written. The specific science of the endocannabinoid system, the receptor network that makes cannabis's effects possible, is one of the most active frontiers in neuroscience, revealing new information about how the brain works, what role endogenous cannabinoids play in health and disease, and what the therapeutic potential of cannabis-derived compounds might be. The specific political history of cannabis legalization, the gradual rollback of 20th century prohibition that is still underway, is creating new data about what happens when societies change their relationship with this ancient substance. The Scythian shaman who crouched under the felt tent with their heated stones would not recognize the modern dispensary, the clinical trial, or the political debate, but they would recognize the experience. 10,000 years of human history and the specific feeling of cannabis, the specific warmth, the specific shift in perception, the specific loosening of the ordinary sense of self, is exactly the same as it was when someone first noticed it in a Central Asian field. Some things don't change, and some things are worth knowing the full history of. Thanks for watching.